All right, everyone. Good afternoon. It's fabulous to have you all here today. Really pleased that we've had a really positive response to this webinar about webinars. I'll admit that I was a little nervous about launching a webinar that was about webinars. I thought people will think that I've gone completely mad. But I actually tried to think about it a little bit, and even that little strap line there under the title of Webinars for Learning about making tech make learning fun was something that I wanted to bring to everyone's attention. I'm really big on learning being fun. It's something that I do a lot of work with schools still, and I think that it's probably the one thing that while we've made learning so high stakes in our country that you've got to learn this or you're not going to be employable, or you've got to learn this or you're not going to get a qualification, or for our kids the ATAR score or the NAPLAN score that you're looking for. We've made learning sort of so high stakes and so important to everyone that we've forgotten that you do your best learning when you're having fun. There was a study that I saw quite a while ago, and it was more a survey, I suppose. They asked people what was the most powerful learning experience of their life, and they said that it was learning to ride a bike came in as the number one. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. One is that you generally are doing it with a loved one. You're doing it with someone who you trust. So there's that gradual release of responsibility when they're holding onto the seat of your bike while you're riding. Then they're holding onto it every now and then all of a sudden you think they're still holding onto the seat of the bike, but they're not. They're gone. And you've found out that you've been riding for the last 30 seconds or so with completely unassisted. But I think the other thing about that is that it's fun when you turn and you look, and that, if you're like me, slightly pudgy, out of breath parent is running along next to you trying to convince you that they've still got the seat when they haven't, and they look hilarious. I saw a friend of mine who was teaching his kid how to ride the bike recently, and I found myself laughing my head off at him, just trying to keep up to convince his kid that he was still holding a seat that he wasn't. Learning should be good fun. And I think webinars gives us the flexibility to make it fun. So first of all, I come with that premise today that I think that webinars should be about having a little bit of fun with our learning. And secondly, I guess what I really love about webinars is that they give you the opportunity to tackle learning differently. We've changed so little about the way that we do learning in our organisations, but also in our schools over the years. If you have a look at a picture of an old classroom and then a picture of a new classroom, the fundamentals of those pictures tend to be not much different. It's just that an interactive whiteboard has replaced the blackboard. It's just that some funky ergonomic chairs have replaced the wooden right-angled ones. And but the basics of what's happening in that space and the basics of the way that space is built are pretty much the same. So I love that this is a brand new platform for us. I know webinars have been around for a while, but the notion that this is something that only over the last few years have we discovered as a way of learning is pretty cool. It's pretty cool. And so it gives me the opportunity to create a learning experience that's, one, tailored, and two, creative. And I reckon that's a pretty cool thing to do. So look, the first thing I want you to do is to understand also that when you build a webinar, that there are different ways that people learn. And what we're going to do is maximize the opportunity to jump into all of them. Whenever I'm thinking about building a webinar, the first thing I do is I start to ponder, why am I running a webinar? And look, to be honest, there's some habit about that for me. I have a bit of a challenge in that I run a webinar every month. So, okay, I've committed to running that Real Learners webinar every single month. And then sometimes I go, okay, what am I going to run a webinar on? And it's probably the wrong way to go about it, because I feel like I've sort of put myself into the habit of running a webinar. And what I really need to do is say, okay, before I even think about the webinar, can I stop and go, what is it that I'm trying to help people with? What's the reason that I would run a webinar? What is it that I know that might be of value to other people? Am I doing it because I've committed to it, it's in my calendar? Or potentially am I doing it just because I'm trying to just get my thought leadership out into the world, or am I doing it because everybody else is doing webinars? Am I doing it because I'm trying to add to my bank of resources to show off to people? And we have to prioritise or rank those ideas and those motivations for why we're running a webinar, and say, okay, what's the good reason? And then once we actually work out what our purpose is for running a webinar, we can get clear about how we're going to do it. We're going to tackle that in just a moment. But you know what I think my favourite reason for running a webinar is because of its imperfection, first of all. There's probably two big reasons that I love running webinars. Number one is that because it's imperfection. I don't have to, make a big deal out of my webinars. Not the same way that I would if I was going to deliver a presentation or a keynote speech. I stress over those, and I want them to be just right, and I want them to be seamless, and I want them to be funny. Webinars can just be kind of messy, and I love that. They don't have to work perfectly. It's all cool. So there's a really relaxed notion to webinars. And I think the other thing about webinars, so relaxed am I in, for instance, that gives me the opportunity here I'm just going to share my webcam with you so I can say hello. I'm hoping that's come up on the screen for you now. The thing that I love about webinars, hi everyone, is that I get to do it in a hoodie. So I think that's really cool, is that I get to go to work and deliver something that's, I think important, but perhaps, you'll be the best judge of that. But I get to do it in my cash clothes, in my office with all my stuff here. I can have a coffee with me. I can have my own water bottle. And I think that's a really cool way to be a leader of learning. You don't have to be the stuffed suit at the front of the room. I think you can get some really cool stuff done in your hoodie. So anyway, that's probably enough of my hoodie. I'm going to stop sharing my webcam with you now. Head back into my presentation. When I get a little deeper about why I want to run a webinar, for me, I start to think about what's my purpose, first of all. So this is a graph that a table that I put together a while ago that helped to guide me into how I do my design of webinar. And I have 4 purposes, and I try to think hard about what is my genuine purpose when I'm stepping into a webinar. I'm wondering whether you can think about what my purpose might be behind this webinar today. So first of all, I think about, am I trying to sell from the webinar? Now, I know that I've got some thought leaders online today. I say g'day to Alan is there and Oscar's there. So I feel a little bit like the old Miss Helena from Romper Room there. But I know that I do have some thought leaders online today. And then they may have the genuine purpose of looking to sell from a webinar. It sounds a bit tacky and a bit icky when I put it that way. But you know what? Some people are coming along because they're doing a little try before they buy. There's a little bit of tire kicking about the reason that they're there. If you're attracting new people or you're launching a new product into the market, at this point, what you want to do is to be really clear that what I'm doing today is giving you the opportunity to make a greater investment beyond the investment of perhaps 45 minutes or so of your time. So if I am selling from a webinar, if I'm launching new product or trying to get people to come into my world because I think that I can be of genuine value to them, I then have a look at the 4 different considerations, I suppose, around approach. And the first one is that when I'm going to sell, content goes down, which means the importance of how much content I deliver at that point is not great. It's not a big deal. Entertainment is not so big a deal either. Now, that sounds funny, isn't it? Doesn't it? Because we tend to associate advertising with selling new products, and advertising tries very hard to be incredibly entertaining and clever and quirky and humorous and confronting and all of those emotional things that happen when people are creating an advertisement. I think that when you're in a webinar, you can't be a 1-hour ad. You really do need to just drop the bells and whistles a little bit and be aware that you're not there to put on a show at this stage. What you are there for is to demonstrate that you understand. So understanding goes up. Eleanor and Oscar, for instance, who are online today, will be very, very aware of what a green sheet means. And that means that we want to demonstrate to people that we have a really deep understanding of what's causing them a problem, of what the challenges are in their work at the moment, of what their ambitions are that are currently being unfulfilled, and how we might be able to step in and give them a hand with that. And that's the kind of action that we're looking for. So we have a higher focus on activation when we're looking to sell from a webinar. We want people to do something. Now, that is something that aligns well with advertising. Most advertising gurus will tell you that there must be a call to action. There must be something that people get to do at the end of the ad or at the end of the interview. And so, when we're selling from a webinar, that's something that's really important. So when I come into a webinar, I'm looking to, if I'm looking to take new product to people and tell people about something new and amazing, my focus is on understanding and activation, less on content, perhaps a little entertainment, but it's no biggie. If I'm looking to inform, so this is the This is probably the oldest mode of education or learning that I would bring across to you now. If I'm looking to inform, what I'm looking to do is to distribute. I'm looking to deliver. I'm looking to transfer. Sorry, things that I know across into now them being things that you know. So the focus on content goes up. I'm in this webinar trying to provide as much content as I possibly can. I usually even prime or preface my webinars for people by letting them know that that's what I'm doing today, and I tell them to relax, that I'll always find a way for them to be better informed afterward. So there is a little emphasis there on the activation. If you look across that column, across that row, I apologise, to, there's a moderate emphasis on the activation part, but I don't make it about entertainment. If I'm there to inform, I want to give you the information and give you as much as I possibly can. And there's some inclination to me being able to understand what you're on about as well. But my main focus is to make sure that I get important content from one place to another. And I think hard about what's the best way for people to immerse themselves into that content. What's the scaffold I can build that will allow them to understand it? I'm hoping you can see that today, this is something that's a reasonably complicated approach for me, I suppose, a complicated approach to webinars. Most people would sort of go, yeah, I'll run a webinar, I'll whack a PowerPoint slide together and I'll give it a go. And that's not a terrible thing to do, by the way. But by thinking deeply about it, I wanted to find a way to organise my thinking. And I thought, if I don't build a scaffold like this table for you and show it to you, then your ability to climb into that content is going to be a little difficult. So I love little organisers like this for that reason. If my purpose is to train, so my purpose is to try and transfer not content but skill across to you, then that changes the whole webinar, to be really honest. The emphasis on content is no biggie. It's sort of that, I like to call that blue line the mant line. Content and entertainment, no biggie. But what I'd really want you to do is to understand what the skills are that you need to deploy, because basically people can know what something is, but they can't go and do it unless I've demonstrated that I understand some of, for instance, the emotion that comes with that. If we go back to riding a bike, it's one thing to be able to watch a video of someone riding a bike. It's one thing to be able to watch your big brother ride a bike. It's one thing for dad to tell you how to ride the bike. It's one thing for mum to promise that she'll get you all the knee pads and the helmets that you'll ever need. Probably doing some horrible gender stereotyping there, but I'll try and fix that up. It's another to do it. So I need to demonstrate to people that I understand that this is a difficult and tricky thing to do. And then I want to activate you. I want to make sure that it's really easy for you to step into doing something after the webinar. If I'm looking to raise awareness, then content isn't so important. I need to appeal to emotion, which is why the emphasis to entertain goes up. I need to bring in story. I need to bring in video. I need to bring in a highly interactive experience. I need to make this 45 to 60 minutes pop and fly. So I focus hard on the entertainment as a means to getting people to take action. There's nothing worse than people being aware and doing nothing, as far as I'm concerned. I often use this when I'm talking to schools that I work with around bullying. One of my huge frustrations around bullying in schools and the way we tackle it is that every foundation, every organisation, every program that has been put together to tackle bullying is apparently doing it in the name of raising awareness. I firmly believe we're probably aware. Haven't met anyone recently who's not aware that we've got a problem in Australia with school bullying. It's time to go beyond awareness. So whenever I'm looking to raise awareness, my secondary concern, or my parallel concern to entertainment, is that I propel people into action. I push them into doing something at the end of the webinar that perhaps they wouldn't have done before the webinar. So like I said, I'm wondering if you can if you can think at all about which one you think I'm looking to do today. What's my purpose for running this webinar today with you? And the truth is, what I'm trying to do is probably mostly train you. What I'd like today is to, I've got there's some content I'm going to get through. I hope that I'm reasonably entertaining, but I would like you to understand the key principles that sit behind a successful webinar. And then I want you to have a go. I want you to go and have a crack at it. So you'll notice that my last slide today is very much geared around, I've labelled it nuts and bolts. So what do you need to know? What's the knowledge gap that you need to be able to move forward? So that's my why, well established in terms of why I'm going to run a webinar. But you know what, there's one more why that you need to keep in mind, and that is their why. So we need to be really clear on, you know, that whole, it's a long acronym, but the WIIFT, which is what's in it for them. You know, we've done the WIIFM, what's in it for me. Now we've got to talk about them. How is it that we can get them activated? How is it that we can make sure that our piece of information, because one of the wonderful things about webinars is it's one-to-many opportunity. But the truth is, I designed the webinar today without much knowledge about what it is that you want to get from it. I made some assumptions about what it is that you need to get from it, and it's slightly unfair for me to walk in and start delivering something that you don't want to, that you don't have any say over. So what I want to do today is, first of all, make it really clear to you that I want you to have your say. So if you have a look at your control panel in the that you've probably got on your screen from GoToWebinar, if you haven't, it's probably docked at the bottom or the side somewhere. Just open that up for yourself. You'll see there's two options for you being able to get involved. Number one is that you can ask questions. If you're having any techie type questions, the wonderful Chris, our business manager, is online today, and she'll keep an eye on that question box and see if she can give you a hand as well. And I'll keep an eye on that question box throughout the webinar and see if there's anyone got any questions or got any prompts. Anything, and I always mention at this point too that if you're thinking that, oh, I better not ask that question, it's probably a stupid question, I'm yet to have a question asked in a webinar that hasn't been of value to someone else. Someone always ends up writing, oh, thanks for that, in the question box. So if you've got a question, put it in there. I don't come at you today going that I'm the guru on webinars. I'm just someone who's done a few, and I've been able to, I guess, field test some principles and theories that I think will be useful to you. And the second way you can get involved is to put your hand up. So pretty much like a regular classroom, I can see the attendee list of all the people who are here today. And because I've got visual on you, if you hit that little button on your control panel that looks like a hand, then I'll know that you're ready to ask a question. I can see that Ben's put his hand up. Brilliant work. Ben's put his hand back down. That's the way it goes. So if you leave that hand up, I have the facility to unmute you, and you might be sitting at a lappy with a webcam or a web mic. And I'll tell you what, I'll forgive you if you're in your hoodie, and I won't turn the cam on, but I can unmute you, and we can hear your question if you'd like to contextualise the webinar at all today. And there's another way that I can get you involved in the webinar today, and it's to launch a poll. So while I have an idea of what I would like to deliver for you today, I'd actually like to find out why'd you come here today. So I'm just going to launch a poll for just a moment here, and I'm wondering, from these 5 options that I've got on the screen, if you could give me an idea of what do you want? What are you looking for? So there are 5 there, nuts and bolts. Do you want to know how do I get started? Do you want to run a webinar that gives people information? Is it to try and make the learning more interesting for people? Is it because you've got new people coming in and you don't want to retrain them every single time by providing the exact same speech every single time they arrive in your organisation? Is it about more topping up your own knowledge about online learning and what's possible in that space? So have a think about those. I'm going to give you another 20 or 30 seconds to go. While you're going, I might be able to have a look and just see. Oscar's got the question in there about what to do when not to use a webinar with adult learners. I think, Oscar, any time that you think you're going to have a lot of troubleshooting to do. So when you're taking complex tasks, and I guess that's different to complicated. I think webinars can be fabulous for complicated tasks when there's a lot of detail that needs to be handed over. But I think when you've got a lot of human work to do and you've got a lot of toing and froing to create genuine understanding. So if you're talking about, particularly you might be delivering a model, and we did some work with Richard Hodge for the Australian Navy, a lot of technical information that we brought into a series of webinars, which is really useful because we could record it and people could get back to it again. But I think that if you were doing topics around things like customer service, or even your work around how to listen effectively, people will have a lot of questions. And if you're trying to inform in that space when there are a lot of questions, then webinars can get in the way, I reckon, Oscar. That's a really fabulous question. Thank you. All right, I'm going to close this poll off here. You've got a bit of an idea of who's in the room today. share those results so that you can see them as well. So people are looking at about how you can make a webinar, make the delivery of some content interesting, how you can do that. There's some people who want to get started, and there's some people going, oh, okay, I just want to get into this online world and just see what's possible. I'm dipping my toe in the water of this stuff and happy to participate a little bit, and that's absolutely cool. So I'm going to hide those results there. Another thing that you can do, I often, when I'm running webinars, I won't do it today, when I'm running webinars, I'll often ask people what role they're in. So I want to know who are the people that I'm speaking to in the webinar, because it's one thing to be able to see your names, but it's definitely another to actually, say, okay, what sort of role are you in? And I can differentiate. This is what teachers call differentiation. I can take into account the needs and the roles of the people in the room, which is a really important thing. So Ben's written here, just to expand on my preference in the poll, some of the webinars we run are for programs that people are required to attend. Motivation's low. And so it's interesting you show some enthusiasm for webinars, since a lot of us here don't like running them. Ben, I'm going to talk to that in just a minute, Ben, because what I want to do is first of all talk to you about the benefits of webinars. But I'll tell you what, Ben, I might hold that question, if you don't mind, for just a minute until I get to my webinar ambition 1. And so what I'll do is unpack that. What I'm often asking people when we're running webinars as part of a program, there's something you can do in that space that I think can make a significant difference for you. Thanks, Ben, for hanging with me while I get to that one. So the first thing I want to do is just emphasize to you what I think are the genuine benefits of webinars. As I mentioned before, I reckon it's the most convenient and comfortable way for you to be able to deliver a one-to-many message. So while there are, even on the GoToWebinar platform, I think the most basic membership that you can buy is allows you to build a webinar for up to 100 people. And that's really cool that I can get to those people while I'm sitting in my hoodie in a comfortable chair. That's really cool. So I think that one of the benefits is that one-to-many aspect of it. The other thing that I really love about webinars is that they're recordable. So all of you will receive a link after this webinar today. Even the people who registered today and didn't come will receive a link to the recording that we make of every single webinar that we run. And that recording is when we genuinely take a learning experience that you're currently present in and flip it, which means that we take the learning to a place that's not the learning center. So here we're online, but if we take it away from the online environment where we're interacting in the way that the people who are in the room are today, we allow people to sit and watch this webinar while they're having a glass of wine on a Friday night, while they're up in the middle of the night with a crying baby, while they're in their lunch break. We flip the learning by taking the important delivery to wherever they're most comfortable to access it, which is really cool. So the opportunity to record this is fantastic. It does 4 things. That ability to record the work that you're doing here allows you to have legacy in your organization, which means every time we take a piece of important content and we put it into a webinar that we record, it becomes something that we don't need to record again until it becomes obsolete. And that's really great, because sometimes there are people in your organization who have contextual technical capabilities that we would hate to see go out the door when they go. So what we want to do is to capture some of their ability to do really difficult things and to present it to people in a way that gives them a better chance of understanding it. That's really cool. It creates legacy for people in your organization. The second thing I think that does is it makes it really easy for you to be able to orientate people. So even when we had the wonderful ability a few years ago, or the opportunity, I should say, to open a brand new school, and when we opened that school up in the Northern Territory, what we realised is that there's a hell of a lot for people to learn. Most people, when they walk into a school, can just sort of, if they're a staff member in school, can gradually get to know the policies. They can look around and see what people are doing and work out roughly what's normal. In our school, there was no normal for anything. But we realised that if we wrote 500 different policies and procedures, and no one would read them. So what we did was we started to record some of the work that we needed to do. When I brought on the wonderful Chris my business manager to my organisation. I needed Chris to take on a lot of the administration work that I'd previously been doing myself in my business. So what I started to do was just record myself in a webinar format doing the things that I needed her to do, and that's basically the last time I did them. The great part about that is that it's not only usable for someone like Chris, but it's usable for anyone else who comes into your organisation. That's what makes that orientation thing come alive. So we've got legacy, orientation, and the fact that it's reusable. And then the other thing that's fabulous about the recordings that you make when you run a webinar is they're pausable. So that means that when you are watching it, when you are watching the webinar, you can stop it, you can think for a moment, you can make a note, you could call someone, you can talk to the person at your next desk, you can make sense of these key points, and then you can continue on with your learning, which is something that you don't get in the face-to-face environment. If you sort of sneezed or your phone buzzed in your pocket, then you've missed a moment. So there's a wonderful leverageable opportunity with being able to pause, rewind, and review some of the work that happens when you run a webinar. For the webinars that I run for the education sector, we have a membership section, and every school that signs up to be a member of our tribe, of our community, has access to every single webinar we've ever done. They populate their staff meetings with it, they populate their professional learning events with them, and they get great benefit from them, and we reckon that's a pretty cool thing. So they're the benefits of it, and now how do you get it? What are those ambitions? So Ben, I want to come back to your question around how do you make webinars a little more engaging. Ben, first of all, if the webinar is a part of a program, it is hugely important that what we do is we think about engagement. I guess, like you pointed out, that people's motivation and engagement in the webinars is low because all we're requiring them to do is attend. All we're requiring them to do is to log in. We know if they showed up only because they logged in. So what we're looking to do is more. So I mentioned before some work we did with Richard Hodge in the Australian Navy, and what we were doing was taking the content to some voiced PowerPoints, a little like you're experiencing today, as part of webinars, and then we recorded those webinars so that they were kept as part of online learning modules. What you have to do in part of those modules is then ask people to do something with it. Now, I think there are 3 levels of questions that we should be asking people to do when they walk away from a webinar. Number 1 is the knowledge level question. This is the basics. And unfortunately, with too much of the way we do delivery, for instance, if the ambition that we had, if the purpose that we had in my little table previously was to inform, then unfortunately, if we inform people and then they can regurgitate back to us 3 or 4 things that they were informed about, we tend to think that they've got it. It is important that they get it, and that's why we ask a knowledge level question after the webinar. We make this as a component of things like an online program as part of a learning management built within a learning management system, and there's some pretty basic ones that you can use to get that done these days. We use Sensei for our online programs, and we find that it works reasonably well. The second thing we do is we ask an application level question, which is the sort of question that says, now what are you going to do with it? We ask them, in your area of expertise, under your roles and responsibilities, how would the knowledge that you have from this webinar be useful to you? What will you do in these circumstances? So that's an application level question. So unfortunately, we usually fall for the trap of providing only questions around knowledge, and people can cheat their way through that. So we ask a knowledge level question, an application level question, and then a design level question. And what we like to do is to be able to put scenarios in front of people. Given this happens, we kind of think worst case scenario. Given this happens, how would this knowledge still be deployable in those circumstances? So for our people in defence, we would say, okay, this is how we're going to keep our vessels seaworthy. Given that there might be a natural disaster in Tahiti and the minister says we need to get 4 vessels to Tahiti within the next 72 hours, and he says it publicly and on the news, and everybody goes, how are we going to get that done? And everyone that, because if we did, and everyone that. So the question is, given that, how could you then stick to this or use this information? And we ask people how they're going to use it under pressure. For teachers, we ask them that here's some theory, for instance, around how to have your classroom run better and some behaviour management tips and tricks, okay, which all sounds fantastic. But what if A kid comes into your classroom one day and he's had a horrible weekend with the family, and the family's in a state of utter distress. He walks in and tells everyone where to go and picks a chair up ready to hurl it across the classroom. What now? And what we need people to do is to think at a higher level. Now, that means what we're asking them to do is to engage. My definition, Ben, of engagement is that engagement is people who are listening, speaking, thinking, or doing. And so my ambition, even in this webinar today, is to get as many of you listening, speaking, thinking, or doing as I possibly can. If you're doing none of those things, you're probably waiting. You're probably killing time. And if that's the case for you, you'll always find something else to do. Motivation and that enthusiasm that you spoke about goes down, and you've picked up your phone and you've started checking Facebook. So there's a risk around webinars that people will show up. This is the reason for the popcorn here. There's a risk that people will show up to a webinar thinking that it's a show, and they don't have to pay attention. And so what we need to do is to provide, to be really honest, a high level of challenge. We need to ask more of our webinar participants if we want them to engage at a different level. Now, we've got to support them to do that. And as I mentioned before, then for me, that's using all the bells and whistles that you've got available to you. You know, design a decent, snappy looking PowerPoint for people. Bring a video into it. Click over to webcam occasionally. Jump in and ask a question. Refer to people by name. Throw a poll into your webinar. Do those little things that allow people the chance to step up and get out of waiting and into listening, speaking, thinking, or doing. I hope that answers your question, Ben, because it was a really good one. Ambition 2 is that we are there in this webinar to serve. I think that far too many people get a little obsessed with the first why I mentioned today, which is my why, and I think that it is equally important that people think about being in a webinar as a gift to other people. I hear a lot of people say things like, you have to be careful in a webinar that you don't give too much away. I want to say quite plainly and clearly that that's bullshit. People are, even if they come to a completely free webinar, they're possibly giving you something far more valuable than their money. They're giving you their time. And I think that it's really important that we come into a webinar not just trying to get people to do what you want them to do, but listening to what their concerns are and trying to be of genuine service to them. So I try to make sure that even if my purpose for the webinar is to sell, that I have to allocate at least 50% of that webinar to being in genuine service to people. I want to give them the best stuff while they're there. If I do, and they walk away from the webinar and they find a little bit of self-help, meaning that they kind of discovered that Adam Voigt was really useful, but we don't need to work with him because the webinar was great, I'm actually okay with that. I think that we need to be in service every time we're leading learning. And if people walk away from it not wanting to work with you any further, then that's just a byproduct of being in service. Being in service means you're not there to serve yourself, you're there to serve others. And I try to think about it in terms of silver service. So even if I were to run a webinar, and I was really pleased that we've had so many people who've registered today, which is fabulous. Even if I was to run a webinar that perhaps has 3 people register and one of them show up to the webinar, which is frightfully sad, but it can happen. It can happen. I'm on in that time. I genuinely believe that I need to bring my A game, and I need to be of genuine service to people when I'm in front of them. They're not getting a B grade level from me just because they're not paying to be here. They're getting my good stuff. Okay, I hope that's really clear. The next ambition that I have, the third of my 4 key ambitions that you need to have in place, is that don't be driven by PowerPoint when you run your webinar. If you've got key points that you want to bring across, go point story. Make your point, sure, but back it up with some sort of story. What I find, and it's funny, sorry to just sort of keep referencing your question, Ben, but that question about people coming along just to comply, or some people will come along and just treat it like a little bit of entertainment. It's frustrating for us, but I do want to point out that if we can include some of that entertainment around our key points, then people get the key point more effectively. I think that it's something in Australia that we haven't probably picked up a lot culturally and in many other domains as well from our Indigenous brothers and sisters. But one thing I think we have picked up in Australia is the importance of a good yarn, the importance of a story. Indigenous people actually have no moral to their story. They don't tell you the point and then a story that unpacks it for you. They just tell you the story and expect you to get the point. But I believe we can work a little bit in that middle ground where we might make a key point, but we use a story or an example or a case study to help people see it in their own world, because unless they do, they ain't doing anything with it. So I often run when I'm working with schools, I talk to them about fair process. This is something that even the Harvard Business Review found as being incredibly important. They said that no matter what you're doing when it comes to conflict resolution in your businesses, that what you need to do is deploy a fair process, because they say that even the people are more likely to cooperate freely with those systems, whether they win or lose by them, if they feel that the process of coming up with a decision has been fair. Now that resonates. Oh, yeah, okay, that makes sense and around that. Yeah, but what's the comparison between a fair process and what I'm currently doing now? And I talk to this story. It's one of my favourite stories of being a teacher. I wonder if you'll find it enjoyable as well. I talked to a story where I had a wonderful group of Year 5, 6 students that I was teaching, and teachers are not supposed to have favourite students or favourite classes, but rest assured they do. And this was my favourite class that I ever taught. They were so awesome, these kids. They were the only group that I've ever really looked forward to letting in at the end of lunchtime. Lunchtime's, the witching hour, and kids come back with all sorts of conflicts that you've got to resolve that afternoon, or their parents are going to go berserk if they go home and you haven't done something about their problems. So that's me sounding a little cynical, isn't it? But this class never had problems. They just had fun, and whenever they came back in after lunch, they were always happy. And so I noticed that the Year 6s were just starting to get a bit antsy, just a little bit arrogant, a little bit of you can't do anything to me because I'm going to high school soon anyway. And they were right, because there was only about 6 weeks to go in the school year. And I went to let them in after lunch one day, and I opened the door and I noticed that the normal joy and chatter was not there. There was 28 students standing there scowling at each other with their arms crossed, and I thought, that's interesting. And so I said, okay, come in. They walked into the classroom, no one spoke. No one glared at me, which I thought was good, because at least it's not my fault. But they certainly glared at each other. They sat down, and I said, can someone please tell me what's happened to my class? And a girl called Melissa put her hand up and she said, nothing, don't worry about it. Okay, I thought to myself, do I dig my heels in here, or do I just teach maths? And I thought, no, I'll dig my heels in, it'll be good fun. And so I did. And I said, I'm just going to sit here and stare at you all until someone tells me what's gone wrong. And Melissa said, fine. We've all been saying mean things to each other and nasty things about each other's mums. If you're familiar with the phenomena of yo mama jokes, then you might have a fair understanding of what had gotten completely out of control at lunchtime. And out of control it had gotten. A girl on the other side of the room exploded with, yes, that's right, Melissa, like you did. What you said about my mum was gross. And Melissa said, well, it's not as bad as what you said about my mum. That was disgusting. And then, bang, there are kids standing up around the room yelling out these your mama jokes. And I thought, I don't think I really need to sit through all of these disgusting jokes, although there was a tiny part of me that wondered whether it might be entertaining. So I said, okay, stop. I think I get what has gone wrong here. What I want to know is how this is making people feel. And Melissa said, I'm annoyed. And I went, okay, and I wrote the word annoyed on the board. And then she goes, no, I'm really annoyed. And she made me write the word really. The girl on the other side of the room yelled out, I'm not annoyed, I'm angry. And so I wrote the word angry on the board. And then a girl near the front of the room, who was, every class has a serial crier, she burst into tears and said, oh, it's making me sad. And I said, okay. So I wrote the word sad on the board, and I walked away and looked at the words on the board and said, that's no good. That's not us. What are you going to do about that? What are you going to do about that? And Melissa sort of, mumbled something about, I don't know, say sorry. And someone said, see, well, we always say sorry and nothing changes. And then a young fella in the room called Regan, who was kind of my AFL ruckman, put his hand up and he said, he said, if we can't do the right thing at lunchtime, then we don't get lunchtime. And a murmur of agreement went across the room, and a boy next to him called Anthony put his hand up, and I'll never forget the one word that Anthony said. He said, ever. And a murmur of agreement rippled across the classroom yet again. There is only one person in this classroom panicking at this point, and it's me. I'm about to lose the last 30 lunchtimes of the year, and any teacher will tell you they desperately need those 30 lunchtimes. So I panicked, and I said, okay, guys, look. How about, maybe it's not that bad. Tomorrow, how about you stay inside at lunchtime and play a board game with the person that you've had a problem with, and then we'll give it another go on Friday. And the kids went, oh, all right. And I went, phew. Because the truth is, I was feeling rather a degree of animosity here because I didn't say anything about anyone's mum. But I always ask people at this point, could you imagine that I flipped the process? And I said, bugger the process. I'm going to jump to the same conclusion that you would have jumped to. So Melissa tells me that they've been saying mean things to each other and disgusting things about their mums. And I say, you know what? I am absolutely disgusted myself about that. I will be keeping all of you in for every lunchtime and recess for the rest of the school year. I think that I would have had a fair bit of mutiny, rebellion, and overthrowing of the king on my hands there. I certainly would have had lots of squealing of that's not fair. So my point is to educators, don't focus too much on a fair outcome. Get the process right, focus on the process. But if I don't have the story in place, then people don't know what I'm talking about. So it's hugely important, even in a webinar, even when we're using tech to try and bring message to people. And Ben, I wonder if this would be useful for you too. I think that one of the things that we tend to do in our organisation when we're running programs and webinars like this is we forget the stories. And even though I think that I'm not a bad presenter, even though I think that some of my information I'm bringing to you today is important, I wonder whether the people who are online today could just think for themselves for a moment over the last 42 minutes. How engaged have you been in this webinar? Compare the two moments where over the last 4 or 5 minutes I told you a story to the 36, 37 minutes where I perhaps have been telling you about content. And a lot of people would find themselves very engaged in the story. So don't forget that in webinars, make your key point, deliver your message, have a great PowerPoint, but don't forget to tell a tale. Hugely important for sense making and for getting people to think at higher levels. And my final ambition that I want to bring to you today is to conclude generously. As I mentioned before, I think that it's really important that we serve when we're in webinars, but I see that a webinar is not me delivering only. I think that I view it as a transactional arrangement, which means that I see that people are coming along and they're giving me their time. I see that by participating in the poll today, you've made a contribution to this webinar that allows me to understand that most of you are here trying to learn how to make webinars more interesting. And I've kept that in mind as we've gone along today. I thank Ben and I thank Oscar for contributing questions today. I think that makes a fabulous contribution to the webinar. And as a result, I like to give back wherever I can, not only through service, but I like to be able to make sure that people genuinely take something away with them. Now, a lot of people who present for a living or who run training or do keynote speaking will tell you should never give away your IP, or you should never give away, for instance, your slide deck. I tend to rail against that. So you'll notice that one of the things that is available to you today, if you look in the handout section of your control panel, is the slide deck from today that you can grab hold of that, because I do want you to get the benefit of being so generous with your time and your effort today. And that's kind of why I record the webinar as well and send it to you. I want you to have the chance to look at it again. I want the people who registered today but couldn't make it because they had other commitments and meetings today to be respected and to have the opportunity to collect both the slide deck if they email me, but also to have this recording from the webinar today as well. I do think that it's really important that we don't think about webinars as being a one-way street. It's a transaction. We're giving each other different things, but I think that it's really important that we remember that giving each other different things doesn't mean that we shouldn't give. We've got to be the real givers here and thank people for giving up their time. So look, I'll move on. I guess the last slide I want to provide for you here is the nuts and bolts. Okay, I've given you some broad themes and things to think about. But if you want to get your first webinar off the ground, I reckon there's 13 things you need to do. So really open up an account in some sort of platform. Now, there are people all over the place who are going to say that, oh, Adam, I don't like GoToWebinar. It's not the best platform. There are better ones out there. I bet there are. Go bananas on them. Find the one that works for you. I use GoToWebinar. I'm saying that you're on GoToWebinar today. If that's good enough for you, go crazy with it. If you can find a better option, do it. Just open an account somewhere. Schedule a webinar. Pop in a cool description. Okay, let people know what they're getting in for. Design a picture-dense PowerPoint presentation. Okay, this is already the level of text on this slide makes me horribly uncomfortable. Get a lovely banner done on Freelancer or Fiverr so that you can let people know in a really colourful and interesting way. Tell people about it. Start your webinar on time. There's nothing like making the attendee list for your webinar drop away, like deciding that, oh boy, I don't know how I'm going to get through the hour. What I'll do is I'll start at 5 past. That'll be 5 minutes killed before I start. People will leave. Start your webinar on time. Share your screen so that people can see what you're up to. Ensure it's recording so that you can leverage your generosity. Use the engagement features, things like I mentioned before, those polls, question boxes. Bring your webinar up, get people who put their hand up unmuted so they can make a contribution, use all the bells and whistles. Save or upload your recording in some way so that you can use it and leverage that later on. Watch this webinar one more time. I have a GoToWebinar. I didn't mean that then. I have a webinar that I watch quite religiously, probably several times a year because of the number of webinars I run by a fabulous presenter called Taki Moore. And it's one about selling from a webinar. Of those 4 purposes I mentioned earlier today, the selling one is the one I feel the most uncomfortable with, so I need to go back to structure. If you look up Selling from a Webinar by Taki Moore, you'll find a webinar that'll help you stay right on track with that purpose as well, which I think is really clever to do. And then rinse and repeat, go and do it again. Do it over and over and over again. We get amazed here at both Real Learners and Real Schools about how our webinar attendee and registration lists continue to just gradually go up and up and up. Stick with it. Not only will people catch on that you're delivering some really great stuff in these webinars, whatever audience it is that you're working towards, but people will also notice that you're getting better at it. Improving webinars, you can follow these 13 steps, but the truth is that the 14th unwritten one is just practice. Get stuck into it and you'll have a fabulous time with them. So look, a couple of things to finish off. First of all, just make sure you download that slide deck. We're going to finish in a couple of minutes today, and I really want you to make sure that you have that gift as you walk away from the webinar today. And then the last thing I want to do is remind you that we've got another webinar coming up in September, on the 20th of September at 2 o'clock. And this one, we talked today about constructing webinars, and next time we're going to talk about workshop construction. And that's about bridging that gap between applause and impact. We don't want to run workshops that people think are fantastic and then they change nothing because they're absent of that activation idea, or they just haven't been engaged or motivated at the level that we want them to. So when you're face to face in front of people, I'd love you to know what the roadmap is, what the blueprint is for being able to construct a workshop that's geared towards learning and change and impact, rather than people just thinking that you're a good presenter. There's some really, you're going to leave this webinar with a template that you'll be able to use in the future to be able to construct a workshop, no matter what the content is that you need to deliver, that makes a real difference for people. So I really want to encourage you to come along to that one. Hope you have a good time. I'm just going to do one final check here that I haven't got any other questions. If you do have a burning question, make sure you get it in there now. I'll do a final check that I haven't got any other hands up as well, and I will let you off the hook. Thank you so much, everyone. It's been fabulous having you here. If we can be of any assistance to you in any way, please feel free to use the contact details that you see on the screen right now. And we'll see you next month for a little bit of workshop construction. All right, all the best, everyone. Bye-bye.